In this chapter, we'll study civil rights. An important concept in this chapter is that equality is at the heart of the concept of civil rights. The term civil rights refers to the responsibilities of government to provide equal protection and freedom from discrimination for all citizens. In other words, the things that government must do. It should not be confused with civil liberties, which we studied last chapter, which really describes what government cannot do. While most minorities have endured discrimination in this country, we're going to take a look at two movements, the civil rights movement and the women's movement, which have had significant social and political consequences. First movement related to African Americans and consequences of slavery in the U.S. The inferior status of African Americans was confirmed in the Supreme Court's infamous Dred Scott decision, which ruled that slaves were not citizens of the U.S., nor were they entitled to the rights and privileges of citizenship. The constitutional inequality ended with the Emancipation Proclamation and the passage of three amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th. 13th Amendment prohibits slavery within the United States. The 14th Amendment says all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens, and that bans states from depriving a citizen of privileges and immunity. And the 15th Amendment established the right of citizens to vote. Let's take a look at some of the important legislation. The Civil Rights Act of 1866, that involves citizenship and further authorized the president to enforce the law with national armed services. The Enforcement Act of 1870, that set out specific criminal sanctions for interfering with the right to vote. Civil Rights Act of 1872, that made it a federal crime for anyone to use law or custom to deprive an individual of rights, privileges, and immunities secured by the Constitution or by any federal law. And the Second Civil Rights Act, 1875, declared that everyone was entitled to full and equal enjoyment of public accommodations, theaters, and other places of public amusement, and imposed penalties on violators. But we found that the early civil rights laws were ineffective for a couple of reasons. One, the 14th Amendment was limited in correcting official acts taken by states. Thus, discriminatory acts of private citizens were not illegal. The second, Civil War amendments and civil rights acts were ignored, and one of the more important Supreme Court rulings, very key decision, Plessy versus Ferguson, that created the separate but equal doctrine. That held that the 14th Amendment did not intend to abolish distinctions based on color, and segregation alone was not unconstitutional. If you look at page 91 of your text, that'll go further into detail on Plessy versus Ferguson. And keep in mind that's a key decision in creating the separate but equal doctrine. And then the Jim Crow laws also explained in your text. There are also barriers that were in place to stop African Americans from voting, that when white supremacist politicians regained control of southern state governments after Reconstruction, they enacted laws that virtually prohibited African Americans from voting. White primary restricted voting to whites only. Grandfather clause restricted voting to those whose grandfathers had voted before 1867. Poll taxes required a fee to vote, and literacy tests required arbitrary reading and reciting skills to allow somebody to vote. And also at that time, Southern social customs and codes of behavior maintained the inferior status for African Americans, of African Americans considered second-class citizens. Some of the examples, Southern authorities rarely prosecuted those suspected of lynching, And one of the crimes for lynching was known as familiarity. A black man who was familiar toward a white woman, if there were action taken by the black man against the white person, the Southern authorities rarely prosecuted those types of cases. By the 1930s, courts began to erode the controversial ruling, Plessy versus Ferguson, and by the 1950s, the Supreme Court explicitly overturned it. And that was done through the 1954 decision in Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka that ruled that segregation by race in public schools violated the 14th Amendment, stating that separation implied inferiority. This was the opposite of the Plessy decision. And the next year, in another Brown versus Board of Education case, court ordered states to admit African Americans to schools in a non-discriminatory way with all deliberate speed. Some states challenged the court's ruling and attempted to block integration, resulting in white riots, violence, and the federalizing of the National Guard. And what we found in a couple of cases that had to do with reactions to school integration, Governor Orville Fabus of Arkansas used the state's National Guard to block the integration of Central High School in Little Rock in September 1957. And when James Meredith, an African-American student, attempted to enroll at the University of Mississippi in Oxford in 1962, violence flared there. And the white riot at Oxford was so intense that President Kennedy was forced to send in 30,000 U.S. combat troops. And ultimately, peace was restored and Meredith began attending classes. An integrationist attempt at a cure, one of those was busing. Geography and residence can complicate attempts at racial imbalance schools. De facto segregation, that's due to patterns of residence and social conditions, different from de jure segregation, that's due to laws or policies of public agencies. A solution to both forms of segregation seemed to involve transporting students. Courts began ordering busing, sending black students to predominantly white schools and vice versa. It led to violence in some northern areas, and by the mid-1970s, it became quite unpopular. By the 1990s, the court backed away from its earlier commitments to desegregation, as did lower courts. In 2001, federal appellate court held that a North Carolina school district had done enough to desegregate. It would no longer be held to constitutionally imposed initiatives. And while many schools experience de facto segregation still today, largely due to high minority populations in urban areas. And today, instead of busing and trying to get that balance, many Americans are really focusing on improving the performance of all schools rather than on making them racially balanced. Beyond the public schools, segregation still existed in the 1950s. The elimination of the segregationist policies and racial intolerance really would not have occurred without a strong civil rights movement. In 1955, Rosa Parks refused to move to the rear of a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, sparking boycotts headed by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and giving birth to the era of civil rights protests. Dr. King formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in 1957, and his guiding principle was a philosophy of civil disobedience. And that's really nonviolent public refusals to obey allegedly unjust laws. He and his followers successfully used peaceful demonstrations and marches to gain wide public acceptance. And the violent reactions to those protests, those nonviolent protests, only strengthened the public support for the growing civil rights movement. In 1963, civil rights leaders organized the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, and massive crowds, millions of TV viewers heard Dr. King deliver his now famous "I Have a Dream" speech, a very key speech in American history and obviously a pivotal one in the civil rights movement. Video of that speech is available under the course documents for this chapter. Please take some time to view that. Again, very critical speech, very important speech in the history of our country. As a result of the March on Washington, plus the media coverage of violent attacks on demonstrators, that led Congress to act, creating a second era of Civil Rights Act, or the Second Reconstruction period. Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the most far-reaching bill of its kind. Prohibited discrimination based on race, color, religion, gender, or national origin. And it specifically covered issues such as voter registration, public accommodations, public schools, employment, and funding cuts for violations. Also created the Equal Opportunity Commission to deal with workplace inequities. Voting Rights Act of 1965. In 1960, less than 30% of eligible African American Southern states were registered to vote. Voting Rights Act of 1965 addressed this issue with two provisions, one that outlawed voter registration tests and one that authorized federal officials to take over registrations and polls if discrimination was detected. One area that hadn't been addressed yet was housing. The Civil Rights Act of 1968 addressed housing reform legislation, forbid discrimination in most housing, and provided penalties for those attempting to interfere with individual rights. And subsequent legislation added enforcement provisions to the federal government's rules against discriminatory mortgage lending practices. Some of the consequences of civil rights legislation led to a dramatic rise in voter registration of African Americans, more than 55% in the South by 1980, and an unprecedented turnout was seen in the 2008 presidential election when the nation's first African American candidate was on the ballot. Today, more than 10,000 African Americans hold elected office, and it appears that race may not be the significant factor it once was in the minds of the voting public. For other minorities, civil rights legislation ultimately benefited almost all minority groups. Hispanics have gained political power and increased their number of elected officials at all levels of government. And Asian American representatives are also seeing an increase in representation.